Okay. Welcome, everybody, to The Matrix, Conversations and Transformations. This is a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles, and our event today is supported by the Remsen Bird Funds. We'd like to thank them. I'm Professor Malik Moazzam Dolat, and I'm joined by the co-organizers of The Matrix, the series itself, Professor Mary Christianakis and Professor Caroline Heldman, who's also the chair of the department. We're also joined by two other members of the CTSJ department. The person who brought all this together, CTSJ Professor Desiree Zamorano. And we are also joined by Professor Claire Crawford. So today we're excited to be joined by journalist and author Talia Lavin. And before we turn things over to Talia Lavin, a quick introduction to the series and our third season, The Matrix third season. So The Matrix itself focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with innovative experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists we can bring to our community. The rest of this third season, we're about 4 weeks in now, will be organized around 3 remaining themes. This event is the first in our Fighting White Supremacy and Global Ethno-Nationalism series. We have 2 other ongoing series this season. The first is Technologies of Surveillance and Resistance in the Middle East, North Africa, and among Muslim groups. And the other is our Ballroom and Ball Culture series that will resume next week, and we'll hear more about that at the end with Professor Crawford. So just as a quick formatting note, it's a webinar. So it means if you would like to ask a question, you would click on the Q&A button at the sort of center right bottom of your screen and type in a question, and we'll be able to see it and respond to it. And with that, I pass things off to Professor Zamorano.
Thank you, Malik. Well, hello, everybody. I just want to tell you how excited I am that the CTSJ department is behind this event, and I'm so excited to welcome Talia. And I wanted just to tell you a little bit about her before she gets started. I first met Talia Lavin on Twitter. I followed her posts, which were quirky, witty, and scathing. I also followed her as she started working on the unionization of New Yorker's staff and administration. And in part, that's inspired my own unionization efforts here at Occidental College. I was also riveted as I watched her give testimony about misogyny and hatred that women online faced. So I have followed her journey throughout this book, and this book, people, Culture Warlords, and I really recommend you read it. I love my copy. The only thing that's missing is an inscription, Talia, so someday when we can meet in person. It is my total honor to introduce Talia Lavin, the ferociously brilliant, funny, and the most fearless person I know. So please welcome Talia.
Oh boy.
You just muted yourself. You just muted.
There you go. I'll try to be funny, fearless, and succinct. I really want to thank CTSJ and particularly my close friend Desiree, who's a phenomenally talented writer and I'm absolutely certain is a wonderful dream of an instructor to have. So for everyone who's here, if you have questions at any point, please, I'd encourage you to pop them in the Q&A box, and I'll try to answer them as they come up. And this is the first time I'm giving a non-Q&A talk about the book. So, if my timing is a little shaky or things seem weird, feel free to pipe up. But I made you a PowerPoint, which is the first time I've used PowerPoint since like 6th grade. So, wish me luck on that. So I'm just going to start and I'm going to talk a little bit. So this is my book, Culture Warlords, available everywhere books are sold. And it's a book that I spent in some ways about 15 months working on, but I've been writing about the far right for a few years now. And the biggest lesson I learned quickly, especially as a Jewish woman who's outspoken online, is that when you look into the abyss, and the abyss is very online, they start looking back at you. And so, within about a day of sort of my first article for the New Yorker about the neo-Nazi website, the Daily Stormer, they featured me and made me the top Google search result for greasy fat kike, which is really every girl's dream. And so that was sort of the impetus for, I'm a very stubborn person, and that kind of reaction, that kind of vitriol made me sort of redouble my efforts and look deeper. And so the book is sort of the culmination of that. And I'm going to share in this short talk just a couple of points that have come up a lot in various interviews around the book, and some points that I think are just sort of the salient points about the superstructure of kind of the far right in the US generally, and particularly its manifestation and metastasis online. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're all in COVID and sharing space with family. So if you hear any sounds in the background, that's what it's about. So look how pretty this slide format is. I love it. Anyway, so Into the Abyss, some lessons from the white supremacist internet.
I'm
So
just going to
first,
say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Talia. You need to share your screen. It hasn't shared yet.
oh gosh, great. I am brilliant.
It's okay.
Okay, share.
There we go.
Let's
There we go.
this again. Okay. Into the Abyss, some lessons from the white supremacist internet. So I wanted to just generally talk about like a broader picture of the US far right. So my book covers kind of the group in the middle here, the crew that just really likes Hitler, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, accelerationists. There are many groups that I could not like encompass within the scale of one book. And there are many excellent books on the far right that cover the broadest sort of the broader movement and subsections and different tendencies within the movement. But just to give you a really big picture, zooming the furthest out we can, so we have the patriot movement, and that's a term that's been around since at least the 1980s. And there we include militia groups, more recently, sort of the most hardcore Trump supporters, the ones who are sort of lost causers already. We have the QAnon conspiracy movement. We have the sovereign citizen movement, which is a broad anti-government movement that has some very interesting theories on what it means to be part of a state. And in these groups, you'll often see discussions of the Constitution, of tyranny, of the Second Amendment as sort of a central feature of their ideologies. The neo-Nazis that I discussed, they are not shy about their racism. They're not shy about their anti-Semitism in ways that other groups sort of try to be a little more covert about. Of course, they're all working towards the furtherance of white supremacy. And when I speak of accelerationists here, accelerationist is a term that spans the political spectrum, but within the context of the far right, I mean, essentially, it's the idea that the best way to achieve our goals is to attain a civilizational collapse and a destruction of the status quo. And when you're looking at white nationalist accelerationists, white supremacist accelerationists, their goal is to facilitate civilizational collapse in order to usher in a white ethno state. And then we have theocrats, Christian dominionists. I invite you to look at the work of Jeff Charlotte, particularly, who's a wonderful journalist, who's done great work on the ways in which theocratic Christian dominionists have sort of really infiltrated the US government and have tremendous influence over US domestic and foreign policy. So that's a kind of broader image of the far right. And now we're gonna kind of focus in on this middle trapezoid or whatever that shape is, rhombus. It's been a while since I did geometry. So I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism first, just because I find it an interesting point of departure. And in some ways, anti-Semitism and the blatancy of anti-Semitism is the biggest distinguishing feature of white nationalism that sort of sets it apart from other forms of the far right and other forms of even conservatism and hard right conservatism in the US. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why anti-Semitism is so central to far right and neo-Nazi movements. Of course, many of us know that this, it's present. I want to talk about why. So anti-Semitism serves multiple rhetorical functions on the far right. It has utility and purpose. It's not just sort of a blind animus, although certainly blind animus is a big part of it. As I write here, it's the intellectual underpinning of much of the ideology. And what I mean by that is that it serves as sort of an all-purpose explainer for everything you dislike about the modern world. So that it's almost a it's almost a cliche. I mean, it became so ridiculous as I was doing the research for the book, how often "it's a Jewish plot" became the all-purpose answer for everything. And that includes trans rights, feminism, queer rights, 9/11, whether the people who are concealing that the earth is flat. I mean, anti-Semitism is sort of the original conspiracy theory. It dates back over 1,000 years. And it certainly serves as a bulwark of conspiracy thought. Within the sort of neo-Nazi right in particular, there's this obsessive focus on the idea that Jews are acting to subvert and undermine the white race, particularly through diminishing its fertility. And so there's this obsession with the idea that Jews are subverting natural, quote unquote, gender roles, that Jews are encouraging immigration, that Jews are encouraging multicultural ideologies in order to facilitate intermarriages and destroy the purity of the white race. And so, it really serves as this kind of all-purpose explainer for everything that white nationalists, white supremacists, the white power movement is a useful term, umbrella term here, sees as degenerate or undesirable in the modern world. And the second major role that anti-Semitism plays is this rhetorical justification for white supremacists to consider themselves victims. On its face, it's difficult for white men to sort of argue that they are uniquely put upon sort of the most oppressed group in the United States. But then you add in the Jew, the sort of concept of the Jew as, Nazi propaganda put it, der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew, who is infinitely cunning, infinitely resourceful, and infinitely malevolent towards the white race. So that by creating this figure, as Jean-Paul Sartre put it in 1948, if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. So that shifts white men from a sort of dominant social group to an oppressed minority, and it also shifts the struggle and the work of white supremacists from sort of working on shoring up and retaining supremacy to a sort of noble struggle against an infinitely malevolent, cunning, and resourceful enemy. So it becomes punching up instead of punching down or laterally. So those are the two sort of broad rhetorical justifications for the dominance of anti-Semitism in a lot of far-right spheres. So I just wanted to talk briefly about how that manifests. And also why. I mean, it confuses a lot of people. Like, aren't Jews white, right? I mean, you saw my face. I'm white passing, white presenting. Yes, most Ashkenazi Jews since around the mid-century, post-World War II, have been white passing in the sense of receiving the social benefits of whiteness in most social contexts. That includes interactions with police in terms of housing, economic opportunities. But paradoxically, it's that very perceived whiteness that sharpens the enmity of white supremacists towards Jews. Because Jews have sort of acquired many of the social benefits of whiteness, they are perceived by white supremacists as infiltrators and traitors to whiteness, seeking to subvert from within. So there's this persistent theme, a really global and consistent theme in white supremacist rhetoric that dates back, before the internet was so dominant. You can see it in the works of the founder of the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell, and other sages of the movement like William Luther Pierce, the author of the Turner Diaries. There's a theme of noticing and uncovering Jewish plots. So one of the most egregious examples I uncovered in my research was a Telegram channel called The Noticer, which has over 10,000 subscribers. And what they do is sort of single out Jews, Jews who are on social media, often on Twitter, and find people who say I'm Jewish in one tweet, and then in another tweet kind of talk about whiteness or white privilege or white supremacy. This is a means to target essentially random Jews, usually on the liberal side of the political spectrum. And the noticer is this theme of like, we are noticing you. We know what you're up to. We are exposing your cunning plan. And on a rhetorical note, there are, a very specific peculiarity of white supremacist attacks on Jews is the use of Hebrew or Yiddish terms, like goyim, which is a Hebrew word for nations, often used to refer to Gentiles or non-Jews. It's not a derogatory term, particularly, but it has been adopted enthusiastically by white supremacists. There's a phrase called the stock phrase, "De goyim know." We know what you're up to. We know what you're doing. That's sort of a continual theme of white supremacist attacks on Jews. They use the term mamzer, which under Jewish law is a very complicated category. It has been sort of roughly translated to mean bastard. Under Jewish law, it's product of a woman's adultery or incestuous union. And it's a category of people who are not allowed to marry Jews. But in the white supremacist context, it's kind of this consistent use of Hebrew or Yiddish terminology in order to sort of use Jewish terminology to mock Jewish pain, in a sort of perverse idea. We know you inside and out. We know what you're up to. Another very, very frequent term that's used is the term Shoah, which is Hebrew for Holocaust. So I've seen countless iterations, of white supremacists describing when they're, say, kicked off Twitter as their account has been Shoah'd. They also say oy vey, another Shoah, every time a Jew expresses sort of pain and anti-Semitism. So it's this sense of both we know you, we know your terminology, we know what you're up to, and also a desire to use one's own terminology against that group in order to inflict greater pain. So another really, really common, this is not so much rhetoric as imagery. I lifted this from the Anti-Defamation League's page. This is the Happy Merchant cartoon. It is unbelievably frequent and remixed in every conceivable way in white supremacist imagery. And it illustrates Jewish scheming, as you see this figure is rubbing his hands together. And this is an image of me that has been posted at me countless times, sort of morphing me into like something more resemblant of the Happy Merchant caricature. And so that's just an example of the ways in which this imagery is used to attack specific Jews. In my case, I'm someone who's outspoken against the far right. Many, many others, including those caught up in the web of the Noticer, and Yeshiva University students, that's an Orthodox college here in New York, have been attacked simply by virtue of being Jewish and had their images stolen and commented on and been doxxed by white supremacists. It's really something, that like any other form of eliminationist prejudice. It's this idea that every Jew is sort of the eternal Jew, and there isn't really discrimination about power or anything. So let's move on. I want to talk about another central thesis of my book, which is the idea that no hate is an island. So although I've spent some time focusing on anti-Semitism, I want to iterate sort of one of the most important points that I learned over the course of my research, which is that hate groups of many tendencies use different chauvinisms as both on-ramps and animating ideologies. So some of the major ones that I see as sort of on-ramps and animating forces, misogyny is a huge one. And I dedicate a whole chapter of my book to the incel or involuntarily celibate movement, which is a radical misogynist movement in the United States and around the world. Xenophobia, particularly demonization of immigrants and migration, hatred of the homeless and or the unhoused, as sort of symbols of degeneration and poverty, and sort of real eliminationist disgust towards unhoused people is a major vector of white supremacist and far-right hatred, homophobia, transphobia, and Islamophobia. And something you'll notice about particularly misogyny, transphobia, and Islamophobia, as well as xenophobia, is that all of these are more or less part of our cultural landscape. They are saturated in our popular culture. They're particularly prevalent in right-wing media. And so they form useful on-ramps. I talk a lot in my book about how people get radicalized. And very often it's YouTube videos, particularly YouTube has been cited both by scholars, but also by the white supremacists that I encountered as sort of a central and very important source of radicalization. So often you'll have these slickly produced videos by right-wing commentators, people like Ben Shapiro or Dave Rubin or PragerU, or Jordan Peterson, that start with misogyny, transphobia, Islamophobia, or xenophobia as premises. And then these begin the slide of the slippery slope for people into further and further and more extremist right-wing ideologies. I talk about misogyny in particular as an illustrative example of this phenomenon when I say that, how misogyny manifests in this sense, in the recruiting sense, is that what these sort of professional misogynists do is not just posit or voice misogyny, but also posit feminism as a destructive ideology. They blame feminism for feelings of alienation in their audience, for feelings of loss, confusion, for feelings that they have not received the life that they are entitled to, or any feeling of loss or lack that they have. And so when you have posited feminism as a source of degradation and alienation, you've accomplished a few things already in this sort of active rhetorical jujitsu. You have posited a socially progressive ideology as a reason for misery. You have created a class of people that it is acceptable to harass, to wit, feminists, particularly outspoken feminists. And you have created then this permission sphere for people to find social orthodoxies repugnant and to blame them for whatever misery they may be feeling in their lives. And the same is definitely true of xenophobia and hatred of immigrants. They're stealing your jobs. Islamophobia, the sort of perennial war on terror, Muslim threat, and very, very paranoid, and apocalyptic tenor of, white supremacists speaking about Muslim immigration in Europe, and transphobia is this idea of they're perverting your kids. They want to use the same bathrooms and locker rooms as your daughters. This threat. So, with all of these, you have this rhetorical jujitsu that gets done. And once you have used these socially prevalent bigotries to wedge open this door, then you begin, you offer up anti-Black racism, you offer up anti-Semitism, and you offer this sort of constructive idea of what should you be doing to combat this threat. You should be fighting on behalf of the white race. So each of these intersectional hatreds are important recruitment tools and important tools to sort of keep the sense of threat that animates white supremacist activism alive. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to make, this is, I think, my second to last point. I know I'm trying to speak as fast as my New Yorker tongue will allow me, but I know I don't have that much time. I want to talk a little bit about the demographics of the movement. So very, very often in media portrayals of who white supremacists are, and certainly in casual conversations and social media interactions, you'll have this idea that, oh, the average sort of movementarian white power guy, is someone who lives in his mother's basement, is someone who is Southern, is someone who is deeply impoverished and otherwise disenfranchised. And I want to say pretty categorically that is not true. There are people of that socioeconomic bracket within the movement, but to say that the movement is solely made up of sort of this mythical sort of working class blue collar guy is really, really categorically untrue. And so in my research undercover in these white supremacist groups, I encountered many professionals with lives and jobs, who had full and robust lives and nonetheless dove into this rhetoric gusto. I would also add that, these are people who will read Mein Kampf and the Turner Diaries and even more obscure texts like the work of Julius Evola or interwar fascists. They have an ideology that is fleshed out by proof texts. It's not, the sort of simple hate that you might expect. And as such, it appeals to a more bourgeois group. We also had a vivid illustration of the ways in which extremism and economic prosperity can dovetail. If you look at the demographic data coming out of the Capitol riots on January 6th, you had realtors, CEOs, an overwhelming number of small business owners. And, of course, this group was significantly prosperous enough to be able to afford travel and hotel reservations at some of DC's fanciest hotels during a pandemic that has been devastating to the working class. So that in of itself is a huge data point when we're talking about the demographics of who forms the US far right and extremism. Hate is often a petite bourgeois movement. Some of Hitler's staunchest and earliest supporters were members of the petite bourgeoisie. And I think that we cannot ignore the lessons of history when it comes to who makes up sort of the ideological and the ideologues and the foot soldiers of white supremacy. And so I would just add, if let's get into manufacturing consent a little bit. Cui bono, who does it benefit to represent hate groups and their members as movements of the poor, the disenfranchised, and the ignorant? First of all, to me, it has always seemed to be a rhetorical move that points at self-absolution. It is often sort of well-heeled liberal commentators who describe white supremacists in this way. It's a way of saying, no one in my neighborhood, no one in my HOA, no one I know personally could hold these ideals. And that is not true. There is no socioeconomic bracket, no level of educational attainment, and certainly no geographical location that delineates or immunizes anyone from this kind of poisonous ideology. I would also add that there is significant overlap between hate group ideologies and the rhetoric of the well-heeled, think tank, conservative movement. It's just a matter of vocabulary and dressing things up in nicer terms and not using slurs. But having studied the ideas that underpin white supremacy, I have often been struck by how much they rhyme. So, you have Tucker Carlson, the heir of the Swanson Frozen Foods fortune, essentially uttering the same points you find on 4chan and 8chan and Telegram and other bastions of the white supremacist internet. He just says it with a bow tie on, but that doesn't mean it's not the same stuff. So, I would implore you to avoid this self-absolution. And of course, any person of color knows that, the Amy Coopers of this world, right? The famous, the woman who famously called the police on a Central Park birder. She was a well-heeled professional woman who was willing to weaponize racism in a possibly lethal manner at the drop of a hat. To suggest that white supremacy is limited to the poor and disenfranchised is both unduly sympathetic and doesn't give enough credence to the potency of the threat and to its ubiquity. So that's that on that. And this is my final slide. There is no hate movement that does not lead to violence. Sorry, this is my second to last slide. Gosh, I really was like trying to prep for everyone. I think that, very, very often, because of the nature of journalism, and I'm not critiquing other folks in my profession here, you seek comment from the groups you're writing about. Very often spokespeople for these groups are sort of honey-tongued. That's why they're spokespeople. And they talk about wanting a peaceful white ethno-state. And they talk about, just wanting white rights, or even in some cases calling themselves white wellness advocates. I'm just here to say there is no hate movement that does not lead to violence. Violence is the nectar that these groups return to again and again. It is both goal and fantasy and sustaining force. Every white supremacist space that I have observed uses violence as a consistent rhetorical device. The concept of stochastic terror, the idea of advocating violence, utilizing dehumanizing rhetoric, and perennially ramping up the sense of threat, is ubiquitous in these spaces. So when we talk about lone wolf white supremacist attacks, when we're talking about mass shooters like Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, when we discuss, going back a few decades, Timothy McVeigh in 1995, these are called lone wolf attacks. They are not lone wolves. They emerge from a movement that is soaked in stochastic terror. And that encourages stochastic terror at every turn. So they emerge from an ideology that is organized out of many people. They are a flock of lone wolves, as it were. And so I would say that because, in my experience, hate movements are uncompromisingly violent, in order to defend marginalized communities and the targets of hate, we must crush it uncompromisingly. And there are different visions for achieving this. I come at this from a leftist perspective, from an anti-fascist perspective. I do not find law enforcement to be a reliable ally in this fight. There is increasing evidence that law enforcement groups and the military are awash in extremism. This is something that we have known for decades, but has been particularly evident over the past year. One very relevant data point is the very disparate response between the George Floyd protests over the summer and the Capitol riot. White supremacist groups avidly seek out members of law enforcement as recruits, and they also, as well as folks in the military, as well, they encourage their members to join the military and law enforcement to gain weapons training, access to weapons, and the power that comes along with those positions. To me, law enforcement, DHS pumping more money into a police state that is actively aligned with white supremacist ideology is not the way to defeat white supremacy in the United States. How do we do it? And here's my slide on anti-fascism. Yes, the dreaded, scary Antifa. You're talking to one and she's managing to keep her voice relatively straight. I want to talk a tiny bit about anti-fascism as an ideology. So anti-fascism is a defensive ideology. Its point of origin is kind of, often anti-fascists track their historical antecedents as the radical socialist and communist groups that brawled with Hitler's brown shirts in the streets. I find a very useful antecedent to modern anti-fascism to be the 1943 group, which is a group of British Jewish ex-servicemen who saw the British Fascist Party under Oswald Mosley continuing to organize in post-World War II Britain and set out to shut them down. And that meant, physically, but also trying to prevent them from organizing in other ways. Anti-fascism is a social movement. It is not aligned with state or state actors. And anti-fascism doesn't have to mean street melees. It often means research. So, one example of an anti-fascist action is if a white supremacist group is having a conference in a nearby hotel, call that hotel and say, you're hosting white supremacists. You are profiting off white supremacists. And seeking to find others, sorry about that, and seeking to force them to move their venue. It means contacting payment processors and, online platforms that host hate and letting them know. And it means spreading awareness within communities of the presence of hate groups and hate group members within their communities. As anti-fascist Molly Conger put it in the Washington Post, if you have the skills to stalk your ex and find out who they're dating on Instagram, you have the skills to find out who's posting under Hitler Lover 1488. 1488 being this is sort of a screen name I made up, but 1488 is a neo-Nazi code. 14 stands for 14 words. A sort of neo-Nazi catechism created by terrorist David Lane. It says we must secure a future for we must secure our existence and a future for our white children. And 88, H is the 8th letter of the alphabet, so 88 stands for Heil Hitler. So this is a very, very, very common white supremacist Nazi code. So I would urge you, if you are interested in becoming part of the anti-fascist movement, which I hope you will, because we really need all hands on deck, start with becoming familiar with far-right codes, symbols, and terminology. Start local, check your local Facebook pages and your local Nextdoor and see what's being said and by whom, and start today, because there's no time like the present. And I love you. So that is the end of my slideshow. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for, I like the applause. So I'm going to look at your questions now. How are the neo-Nazis of today related ideologically to the German Nazis, and how do they differ? It's an interesting question. I mean, I would say that, first of all, neo-Nazi is like one subset of the broader far right. There are many, many neo-Nazis who simply relate ideologically by trying to copy them. By studying Hitler, reading Mein Kampf, getting SS tattoos and using SS symbology, and of course, adopting, the same preoccupations as the Nazis, particularly with Jews, particularly with racial purity, with being Aryan. But there are many, many tendencies of the far right that don't sort of map onto neo-Nazism particularly. There are people who embrace Hitler and love him, but he's just one of their inspirations. So, you know, it's everything in the modern white supremacist movement. It's sort of like a mixtape of the worst of history. It's chopped and screwed, but very little is original. And using the magic of the internet, you can find, you know, eugenics texts and Confederate ideology and, you know, uh, images from fascist and far right movements from across the world to inspire you. So, you know, I would say like it's not sort of classical Hitlerism is relatively rare. Although there are certainly are groups that identify themselves as national socialists that still organize around the country. Um, but you know, much of modern white nationalism and the white power movement is a pastiche rather than a direct, you know, a direct one-to-one mapping with German Nazism. Okay,
Talia,
how do you,
I'm just going to interject here. I love your phrase, mixtape of the worst of history. That's brilliant. And I also want to give you some kudos for your whole chat before you go into these questions, because I just loved it. And I was writing down things and phrases as you were going through it. I just loved it. So I just wanted to give you some kudos. And I'm looking at the questions and I am totally with Mira. I want to know the answer to this. How do you stay outspoken and protected in this abyss?
So it's an interesting question. It's not easy. And sort of there's like a fair amount of the book that deals with the psychological fallout of staying immersed in this stuff all the time. And I would say the biggest source of strength for me has been camaraderie, finding other people who are doing this work, speaking to them, talking about the insane stuff that happens to us, like featuring in an anti-Semitic caricature or having your parents get a letter from a hate group in the mail, you know, being doxxed, being threatened day in and day out. It is a bit like immersing yourself in vitriol and poison, and something that I am absolutely still doing as we speak. It has not stopped at the book. This is still my beat. It's something hard. You have to find what gives you love and strength and nurturing, whether that's family or cooking or hobbies. But I'm not going to say it hasn't taken its toll. I would just say that I find that toll to be worth it. But, you know, practically also, there are things you can do. I subscribe to a service called Delete Me that you know, removes my data from data brokers like whitepages.com or Spokio. You know, I take certain steps to make sure that, for example, if I'm in a place and I'm taking an Instagram photo, I will wait for like several hours after I've left to post it. I'm very cagey about where I live. You know, there are ways in which I sort of try to keep myself protected, but of course, a sufficiently determined foe could find out where I am. My feeling is always that I am more determined than I'm more angry than I am scared, and I'm more determined than I am angry. I find it worth it. The toll is worth it. But there is a toll.
And then thank you, Talia, for being so honest with us. Of course, there's a toll. And I also love that you ended your presentation with a call to action, that there are things that we can do if we are so motivated. I want to bring up Katie's question here about were most of the Capitol rioters members of the Patriot Movement or the White National Movement? Is there large overlap between the groups? Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that, you know, two of the biggest hits of the white nationalist movement during the Trump era were Unite the Right in Charlottesville in 2017 and the Capitol riot, sort of bookending the first year and the last of his presidency. And they were very different events. But what they shared in common was the convergence in physical space of different tendencies of the far right. So I would say the majority of the Capitol rioters were members of the Patriot Movement, broadly conceived. You know, heavy QAnon presence. Of course, the premise was keeping Trump in office. But there were also figures I recognized from the neo-Nazi fringe. There were the Proud Boys, who sort of straddle the white nationalist and patriot line. And there were militia members as well, who are sort of firmly in the patriot corner. And of course, the other big rhyming sort of through line between these two events is that they were both fatal. And that goes back to my point about, white nationalism and the white power movement being one that thrives on and ends in, and whose goal is violence. And so there is overlap between the two groups in the sense that many patriot movement groups have sort of goals that seek to uphold a status quo that is that operates in defense of whiteness, and who speak of themselves as sort of a response force to stuff like racial justice protests, who will show up armed to intimidate racial justice protesters. They have a lot in common, but it's sometimes a matter of aesthetics. It's sometimes a matter of age demographics that sort of distinguish them. I would say they broadly have similar goals. It's just a matter of sort of, there are ideological differences. I mean, the patriot movement is full of sort of very unabashed American nationalists, whereas the white nationalist and neo-Nazi movements are a little more jaundiced about, say, capitalism. They map a little less precisely onto sort of more traditional conservative ideals, can even present a critique of capitalism that comes back down to anti-Semitism in the end. And so there are differences, but ideologically they often serve the same goal, and that's why they show up at the same places.
So another question here that I don't think we can get to everything, but I want to point you out to the last one. How do you deal with the subversion of Antifa as an organization and the magic of the internet that has painted Antifa as a terrorist group in right-wing rhetoric? I mean, I think Antifa itself is a right-wing rhetoric term.
Yeah, well, it's not, okay, so, yeah, I see that, it's a complicated question. Antifa as a term originated from German anti-fascists. It is a German term. It's short for Antifascistische Aktion. So, you can see why that is useful in a foreshortened form. It was first adopted in the US in 2007 by Rose City Antifa in Portland, who were a group of anarchists seeking to shut down a white power skinhead music festival. So the term doesn't originate on the right, but the bête noire, this idea of it as a nebulous and malevolent threat that's popping up everywhere, is synonymous with Black Lives Matter, is ready to invade your town, at any moment and smash up your white business, is definitely a creation of conservative and far-right media. It's a creation also of centrist media that seeks to strive towards a presentation of balance, that sort of seeks to sort of present itself as fair by pointing out that there are extremists on both sides. To me, the sort of central difference is there's a really big difference between going into a town, often busing in people from an entire geographic region with the goal of intimidating the local populace and promoting genocide, versus showing up in order to protect the local community, including physically, but also with a diversity of tactics, including research and communication with, event organize, the premises of an event, and all kinds of different anti-fascist tactics. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering this super coherently, but I would say that, First of all, I have a whole chapter in my book called Antifa Civil War that speaks specifically about the media creation of Antifa and the absolutely absurd myths peddled under that guise. And secondly, I would say, seek out resources from anti-fascists about this stuff. One actually excellent book that I can recommend to all of you wholeheartedly is Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray, that will give you a much clearer idea of of the sort of history behind the movement and where it comes from. It's a wonderful little book, and I found it riveting. I also wanted to answer the question, would you say that this is primarily a problem in the US as a result of the culture, or is this as big of an issue globally? It definitely is a global movement. So in the book, I talk about, so first of all, Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch mosque shooter, was Australian. He committed his atrocity in New Zealand. It is a broad problem in Europe, and I talk about certain adventures with a Ukrainian neo-Nazi who I eventually exposed. There are fascist movements in Britain, with UKIP, across the EU. There are still fascists in Germany today. I would say that the US exports a lot of hate ideology. There's also, to me, a really interesting, sort of capsule summation of just how global the movement is and how interconnected it is through the internet, is one particular example. So Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch mosque shooter, donated money, a significant sum, to Martin Sellner, the creator of the Generation Identity white supremacist movement in Europe. Martin Sellner has an American fiance, Brittany Pettibone, who is a white supremacist YouTuber. And so, that's going from Australia to New Zealand to Austria to America in just one financial transaction. That's the power of the internet. It's all interconnected. And there are lots of different stories of, US white supremacists training abroad. Training in Ukraine, for example, which has a large far-right movement. It is definitely a global movement. So, the internet connects us all, and that can be a wonderful thing. And it can also be, a very powerful force for the spread of noxious ideologies and the turning of white nationalism into white internationalism. The idea that, every white majority country should be a white ethno state. There's a lot more to say. I talk a lot about in the book about the sort of schizophrenic way, duality of the ways that white supremacists in the US and around the world see Europe as both the sort of historical cradle and birthplace of whiteness, and also a place under existential threat by migration and sort of a hellhole. So, it's certainly globally it is rhetorical as well. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Talia. I just want to thank you for living up to your billing, for all of your brilliance, and for your attempt at distilling this 15-month-long saga into a 40-minute presentation. So for those of you who have more questions, get the book, okay? Support Talia. Also, I wanted to pass this off to Claire.
Thank you, Talia, for your presentation. It was great. Just keeping everybody engaged with the Matrix. Next week, Thursday at 12, we'll be back with the Ballroom series, where we will have Michael Roberson, a scholar, activist, ballroom member, health theologian. He will be here to talk about the connection between church and ballroom, and particularly thinking about Black trans women as godly. So hope to see you all then.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks again to Desiree for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for having me, and have a great day.
It was so wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.